looking at it the other day, I realized there was something missing that's really key to titles in academic discourse. I don't know if you noticed what's missing, but there's no, what's missing is that there's no colon in the title. And I was horrified. You have to have a colon in the title. And I also like the pun on higher education versus higher.
Oh, I like that.
Right, doesn't that work? Yeah.
I like that.
It turns out if you Google higher education, there's a bunch of organizations devoted to educating you to get hired in something. So don't get too excited. Don't get too excited about it. But so my talk now has a colon in it, and it's called Higher Education versus Higher Education: The Survival of the Humanities in the Age of the Corporate University. Before I start, thank you, Jamie, for the introduction, and thanks. If you don't like the keynote, you can blame Jamie, because apparently it was her idea to invite me here, and somehow she convinced Walter and everybody else that it was a good idea. So I'm here. Yeah. And then Walter emailed me, and my job was to survive long enough to come here. And I've really enjoyed the presentations. It's an extra treat for me to have spent the day listening to so many interesting talks about survival. So thanks to everybody who gave their presentations. So let me begin before I spend all my time just doing preliminaries. The humanities have always had a kind of paradoxical position in higher education. Perceived as a central pillar of the liberal arts, which are really unthinkable without them, they've nevertheless been in a nearly perpetual state of crisis, dogged by questions about both their practical value and their intellectual rigor. Articles about the humanities being in crisis began appearing all the way back in the 1920s, and they continued to pop up with some regularity in the 1940s, well into the 1960s. In fact, in 1964, there was an entire book of essays published devoted to the subject of the crisis in the humanities. And then, of course, well into the 1980s and into the 1990s. Indeed, it's hardly any exaggeration at all to say that over nearly the entire course of the 20th century, there's been a robust and recurring debate about the value of studying the humanities. Debates that continue to accelerate during the 1980s as people both inside and outside of higher education began to worry that the rise of critical theory and political correctness and the increasing professionalization of humanities faculty were alienating students and exacerbating the gulf between the professoriate and the wider culture. So there's hardly ever been a time when the humanities weren't in crisis. Which means until fairly recently, these debates were largely business as usual in higher education. What's changed? What's gotten us to the point where we're starting to talk or worry about the very survival of the humanities is the increasing corporatization of higher education. The convergence of a set of economic, institutional, and ideological changes that, if they don't threaten the survival of the humanities, they certainly threaten to both trivialize and marginalize the humanities. Of course, I'm not alone in making this argument. Lots of commentators writing about the plight of the humanities today connected to the corporatization of higher education. But I want to pause and ask, what do we mean when we refer to the corporatization of higher education? For me, the corporatization of higher education has to do with the convergence of a set of interrelated developments, some of them structural, economic, and managerial, but others having to do with values, with shifting notions about what higher education is for in the first place. At the structural and managerial levels, the corporatization of higher education is embodied in the fact that universities more and more are being run as corporations, both in terms of their managerial hierarchies and their stress on the economic bottom line. College and university presidents operate as CEOs, in an environment in which shared governance is on the wane. Faculty have less and less say about broad educational goals and curricular and program matters than they did in the past, which means not only disciplinary knowledge, but disciplinary values take a backseat to economic exigencies or administrative ideas about what will sell to students and to parents. Boards of trustees are increasingly made up of CEOs, bankers, hedge fund operators, and real estate developers who, not surprisingly, bring a business mentality not only to the budgetary and administrative aspects of education, but often to the philosophies of education as well, to their philosophies of education as well. More and more, at most colleges and universities, the academic culture has to compete with a business culture, and in that scenario, the humanities are in a particularly precarious position. The ascendancy of a business culture on college and universities reflects the fact that we live at a time when students, their parents, and state legislators increasingly envision higher education as vocational training, a form of credentialing in which the value of courses and programs are defined narrowly in terms of how they will prepare students for jobs. This trend was dramatically exemplified by Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker's recent attempt, here it is, to revise the mission of his state university system by replacing references to the search for truth, the need to improve the human condition, and to serve and stimulate society with the goal of meeting, quote, the state's workforce needs, unquote. A phrase which, as you can see, he proposed moving up to the very beginning of the mission statement. This quickly became famous. I assume you've already seen this. And then he rescinded it and said it was a mistake, but it wasn't the kind of mistake he wants us to think it was, right? in my view. So in an educational environment like the one Walker envisions, the stress is on an educational ideal that puts a premium on computational, technological, and mechanical skills rather than on a broad-based education in history, philosophy, and the arts and languages, writing. In an environment like this, the humanities inevitably lose. This dramatic shift in views about the purpose of higher education has developed at a time, of course, when both taxpayers and legislators have dramatically cut back their economic support for education, especially for higher education. This has happened in both Wisconsin and in my own state of Illinois. Indeed, Janet Napolitano, president of the University of California, has recently pointed out that during the years of the Great Recession, 44 out of 50 states, 44 out of 50 cut funding on a per-student basis to their public institutions of higher education. These cuts and the mentality that produced them are, of course, largely responsible for the accelerating casualization of labor in higher education, a development that threatens institutional power, the institutional power of faculty, and the quality of education in the classroom. Not that adjuncts aren't great teachers, but they get stretched to the limit by driving all over town, teaching at 4 or 5 different schools, sometimes without an office, and it's a scandal. While these developments threaten the viability of a liberal arts education everywhere, they represent an especially dire threat to the humanities, which are particularly vulnerable in an age of shrinking budgets and the expanding dominance of this new educational ideal. There was recently an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. You should see what you guys look like through my reading glasses. It's really good. There was an article in the Chronicle, that's better. An article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed by a guy who teaches at one of the Wisconsin university systems. And he pointed out that the 2.5% budget cuts that had to be implemented at his school cut right into gen ed. So all the general ed requirement courses had to go off the boards. and electives went up. So the kinds of courses we teach in the humanities in a gen ed context went out the window almost immediately. So my argument is that the so-called humanities crisis has as much to do with what's going on outside higher education as it does with what's going on inside higher education. The threat to the survival of the humanities isn't coming, and I'll have a lot more to say about this in a moment. The threat to the survival of the humanities isn't coming from innovation and change from within its disciplines. It's coming from a shift in educational values outside that, at a time of sustained economic recession, has produced a troubling move to cut back funding for the humanities because they're increasingly seen as only marginally important to a 21st century education. In this country, it seems to me we're not investing in higher education, we're divesting in higher education. And in that process, the humanities are taking a particularly big hit, and that's the thing that has to change. Now, the corporatization of higher education is both a symptom and a cause of a dramatic shift from one model of education to another, a shift from a liberal arts model of education to a largely vocational training model of higher education. And I believe that the survival of the humanities is going to depend on how we respond to this shift, how we resist or push back against this shift. A liberal arts model of higher education has always been geared toward producing cultural rather than economic capital. It stresses broad intellectual enrichment over immediate practical, mechanical, or professional utility. Studying the arts and sciences has always been, at least ideally, about nurturing the free thinking of the free individual. The word liberal, of course, comes from the Latin libere, meaning free, unrestricted, unimpeded, and though the word had its ups and downs in the 15th and 16th centuries, by the Enlightenment, at the very time when the modern university is beginning to develop, it was firmly associated both with tolerance and freedom from prejudice. The ideal of a liberal arts education was always civic rather than vocational. It was aimed at providing the kind of foundational knowledge and skills in the arts and sciences that are fundamental to sustaining democracy and nurturing the capabilities of free citizens to work together economically, socially, and culturally. The new vocational model of higher education represents a drift away from the liberal arts model and a dramatic narrowing of what it means to be educated. And of course, because the humanities have become so central to a liberal arts education, the more we drift away from the liberal arts model, the more the humanities are put in jeopardy. As we all know, measured by a value system that puts the practical, the vocational, and the professional utility of learning at its center, the study of literature, languages, writing, the arts, philosophy, and history end up being threatened with marginalization. Worse still, the value of a free and unfettered exploration of knowledge gets marginalized. Why is that? Because in the liberal arts model of higher education, the idea is that both the student and her professor are free to explore knowledge without that exploration being subordinated to a specific professional practice or application that would tie learning to the interests of that practice or application. The vocational training model ends up threatening to undermine that kind of freedom. It puts the marketplace value of a college degree ahead of the value of a general education in the arts, languages, history, and philosophy, an education that puts a premium on the free and disinterested exploration of knowledge, and which has traditionally been understood as necessary to the shaping of civic responsibility. From my point of view, one of the big problems with this shift from a liberal arts to a vocational model of higher education is that it pits what many humanists like to call knowledge for its own sake directly against the teaching of what critics of the humanities like to call practical skills. The bad rap on the humanities is we don't teach practical skills. It's not a practical educational pursuit. So on the one side, you have the humanities associated with the pursuit of non-utilitarian knowledge, and on the other, you've got the STEM disciplines, ostensibly focused narrowly on scientific knowledge and technical and mechanical skills. The gulf between the two threatens to increase, and I think that's a real problem. The danger here is that STEM students and their parents often end up seeing humanities courses as a needless and time-consuming hindrance to their education, while humanities students develop the habit of thinking that the problems treated in STEM disciplines have nothing to do with the ones that they're exploring. I think this kind of either-or mentality makes it more difficult to develop a robust, comprehensive explanation of what students learn in the humanities. I want to explore this threat in a little more detail in a minute. But first, I want to try to identify just what it is about a humanities education that makes it not only special, but necessary. If we're going to have to make a case not only for the survival of the humanities, but for their centrality, then, I mean, why not go all the way? We don't want to just advocate for the survival of the humanities. We want the humanities to remain central. I think if we're going to do that, we're going to have to explain what a humanities education provides our students that they won't get in other disciplines, as valuable as those other disciplines are. As I've already indicated, I think it's important that we stress that the humanities disciplines teach both subjects and competencies. Subjects and competencies. Literature and the visual arts are subject areas, but when students take courses in these areas, they not only learn about the history of literature and the history of art while becoming familiar with a representative range of texts and works and artists and writers, they also develop competencies. They learn how to recognize, appreciate, research, analyze, and think critically about aesthetic form and aesthetic experience. That's not all, but that's a central feature. History is a subject area. But when students take history courses, they don't just learn about important historical events. They learn how to read, research, analyze, think, and write critically about a whole range of things from a historical perspective. If literature and art students learn how to think aesthetically, history students learn how to think historically, how to analyze things from a historical perspective. And of course, it's the same with philosophy. When students take philosophy courses, they don't just learn about the history of philosophy and become familiar with important philosophers and their ideas. They also learn how to think philosophically, to analyze events, ideas, ethical and moral claims, texts, and the arguments of others from a philosophical perspective, from an abstract perspective. Which is to say, they enrich their ability to think about things not only in an abstract but a skeptical kind of way. Each of these disciplines then is valuable for the bodies of knowledge that they transmit, but they're equally valuable for the competencies or skills that they teach students. The reading, analytical, research, critical thinking, and writing skills that students in the humanities learn. And if you add to this the concrete skills that come from learning foreign languages and from taking rhetoric and composition courses, collectively, you've got a very powerful constellation of disciplines in the humanities. For this reason, I think it's dangerous to fall into the trap of seeing the humanities as either inferior or superior to the STEM disciplines because they aren't focused on the teaching of practical competencies and skills. Because they are. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of humanists don't want to stress the teaching of skills at all. Many of them see any attempt to explain the value of the humanities, the value of a humanities education based on the teaching of concrete skills as a form of selling out. The idea that a college or university education ought to teach students competencies or skills has become so associated with the vocational model of higher education I talked about a moment ago that many humanists simply see it as an anathema, whether they're traditional or progressive in their politics and educational philosophies. They don't want anything to do with that language. Because the marketplace itself and marketplace values, which are so closely associated with the corporatization of higher education, seeming increasingly to be marginalizing the humanities in higher education, many humanists simply shy away from stressing the skills they teach their students. Indeed, they often see those of us who do want to stress the value of the skills we teach our students as in effect capitulating to the enemy. I think this is really an unfortunate mistake. This divide is unfortunate. It seems to me that those of us who teach in the humanities or who value their role in higher education shouldn't feel ashamed about underscoring the value of the transferable skills we teach our students. Skills which, as I pointed out a moment ago, are central, if not unique, to the humanities. Indeed, I believe the survival of the humanities is actually compromised both by humanists who narrowly insist the humanities simply have a timeless value rooted in a tradition based on the value of knowledge for its own sake that makes any talk of skills vulgar and reductive, and by those who argue any stress on the concrete competencies humanities students learn is a capitulation to the enemies of higher education. I think the survival of the humanities depends upon our ability to transcend these debilitating and simple-minded binaries. What we need instead is a way to articulate the value of the humanities in higher education in a more complex way, in a more nuanced kind of way, one that will have a broad appeal to the general public, to potential donors, and to state legislators, the collection of people who together control the purse strings of higher education, both public and private. Now, paradoxically, it's both critics of the humanities and some of their most ardent supporters who insist the humanities have no practical value. On the one side, critics of the humanities who see them as a waste of time in an age when students need to use higher education as a springboard to jobs seem unable to acknowledge the value, the practical value of a study in the arts, the practical and the abstract value of study in the arts, languages, philosophy, and history. And on the other side, advocates too often advocates of what I've been calling the liberal arts model, particularly those seeking to defend the value of the humanities against the bottom line values associated with the vocational training model, sometimes reject altogether the idea that the value of the humanities has anything at all to do with the teaching of skills and competencies that are transferable to the workplace. As a humanities professor advocating for the value of the humanities, I'm particularly concerned about how this division hamstrings our ability to make a comprehensive case for the humanities. Of course, an education in literature, the arts, history, philosophy has a value for its own sake that transcends the merely utilitarian. Indeed, a chief value of the humanities is that they provide a space for exercising critical skepticism about our society's preoccupation with the practical and the utilitarian. But at the same time, students in humanities courses do, in fact, learn important skills that are transferable to a broad marketplace of jobs in the public and the private sectors, in for-profit and not-for-profit companies. No matter what their vocational interests are, no matter what their political position is on the values associated with our economic system, our students are still going to need jobs when they graduate. This is what I tell my Marxist friends when they get mad at me for taking this position. They're still going to have to get a job while they struggle to overthrow the system. I believe we have to be deeply committed to protecting the humanities from a view of higher education, like Scott Walker's, that puts the primary, I can't believe we're talking about Scott Walker, but I'm talking about him. A view that puts the primary emphasis on the teaching of job-based skills. A state university system should not mainly or most directly be about producing a state's workforce. However, I'm also worried that advocates of the humanities who are either unwilling to make a case for the humanities, at least in part on the transferable skills they teach students, or worse still, see anyone who does so as complicit with the market-based enemies of the humanities, are actually making it more difficult in the current political climate to defend the value of the humanities. Critics of the humanities actually win when humanists become so dogmatically defensive about the humanities that they're unwilling to acknowledge the skills that they're teaching students, or worse still, portray anyone who does so as siding with the enemy. We need to find a more subtle, more elastic, more balanced way to articulate the value of the humanities than that, both because it's intellectually correct to do so, but also because I think it's rhetorically necessary given the current political climate. I believe we need to avoid idealist approaches on both sides, either the traditionalist or the progressivist side, that dig in their heels and become dogmatic. And I'm really good at being dogmatic, but I think it's counterproductive in this context. Although maybe I'm being dogmatic about all of this. Instead of being idealistic and dogmatic, I think we need to think pragmatically about how most effectively to make the case for the humanities now under present circumstances. Now, one way of making the case for the humanities is to rebut some of the misleading claims being made about them. While they are under threat by the economic, institutional, and philosophical changes I discussed a moment ago, it simply isn't the case that when measured either by enrollments or by unemployment numbers, that the humanities and humanities students are doing all that badly. I think while we deal with the concrete institutional, economic, and social forces that threaten to marginalize the humanities, we also ought to stress their overall robustness and to counter some of the misleading claims in attempts to defend them. For example, many who insist the humanities are in crisis cite as evidence a steep fall-off in humanities enrollments, arguing that they are the result of the humanities having turned their back on traditional subjects, writers, and texts in favor of theory, political correctness, and the teaching of non-canonical texts. However, there's little evidence to support this claim, and we ought to say so. As many researchers have noted, these critics use 1970, there it is, 1970. These critics use 1970, the historical high point of the humanities majors, as the year from which they chart a decline. But as Ben Schmidt, who's crunched the numbers, this is his chart, demonstrates, enrollments in the humanities have held fairly steady between 1984 and 2010 at about 6.5%, with some upticks, as you can see, between 88 and 96. And here's Schmidt's observation about this. Where? Here it is. Schmidt observes, quote, that the overall pattern here gives the lie to any arguments that claims the humanities are being eroded by things like ethnic studies or a departure from the classics. Students aren't any less interested in majoring in history or English now than they were at the moment deconstructionism hit American shores. And while what's really interesting about this graphic, and I want to think more about it, is the bubble I'd like to know why the bubble, right? I mean, everybody gets hysterical about, oh, nobody's majoring in the humanities anymore, but it's because they start from here to measure it. But if you start over here, it's not off that much. But what happened during the 1960s? I mean, I think it's fairly obvious, some of the things. But people tuned in and dropped out and went to college in the humanities, I guess. But I find that really intriguing. Anyway, that wasted 5 minutes I didn't have. Students aren't any less interested in majoring in history or English now than they were at the moment deconstructionism hit American shores. And while the number of English majors has fallen at some Ivy League institutions, according to Scott Saul, writing last year in the New York Times, nationwide English majors have held steady at between 9.8 and 10.6% over the last 2 decades. And he notes that according to the Humanities Indicators, a project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the share of bachelor's degrees earned in the humanities has stayed remarkably steady between 1987 and 2010. 10% in 87, 11% in 2010, with some brief fluctuations over the period. And Saul echoes Schmidt in pointing out that these statistics suggest that we must straighten out one of the great misconceptions that has circulated around humanities professors that we're a trendy lot, tenured radicals, wrenching the curriculum into irrelevance as we impose the latest theoretical paradigm upon it. Critics who make that argument are engaging in ideological polemics. They simply don't like the intellectual orientation of much new work in the humanities, but they don't have the empirical data to back up the argument that theory drove enrollments down. There was a bubble and they start at the top of the bubble in making that argument. It's a simple fact that enrollment dips tend to correlate with economic recessions, not with the rise or fall of theory. There were 4 recessions between '69 and the mid-'80s. Four recessions here. Now, another argument that we need to rebut is the claim that humanities majors aren't qualified for jobs when they graduate and so have a great deal of difficulty finding employment compared to other more practical majors. There's been a lot of recent good news actually on the income that humanities majors are able to generate. The most recent good news came last October in a study published by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences showing that the median salaries in 2012 for humanities graduates, there they are, median is yellow, the median salary for humanities graduates was $51,000 compared to a median salary of $56,000 for all workers with a bachelor's degree. In my view, that's not a huge difference. It's not a huge difference, especially when you consider why students major in the humanities in the first place. They're not out to make a lot of money. They're interested in other things. The real scandal is the gender differential. $59,000 for men, $45,000 for women. That's the real scandal. And humanities students who go on to earn an advanced degree with their, find their median salaries jumping up to $71,000. These statistics bear out other statistics that I talk about in my book, which I'm going to skip over because A, they're in my book, and B, I don't want to take too much time and go over. I don't want the red stop sign being held up to me. The advantages that employers see in humanities graduates are underscored in a 2013 survey of business leaders conducted by the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Their report is titled, "It Takes More Than a Major: Employment Priorities for College Learning and Success." And it makes clear that employers are less interested in narrow knowledge in specific fields than they are in broad knowledge and transferable skills. The association reported that 93% of employers felt that the capacity to think critically, communicate clearly, and solve complex problems is more important than a candidate's undergraduate major. Over 75% of those surveyed want job applicants schooled in critical thinking, complex problem solving, and written and oral communication. The employers who were surveyed about their key priorities ranked quantitative reasoning and knowledge about science and technology at the very bottom, at 55 and 56% respectively, while humanities and liberal arts skills were ranked at the top. The study also revealed broad interest among employers in graduates with a knowledge about human diversity and global cultures, the ability to perform evidence-based reasoning, including analysis, communication, critical and creative thinking, a facility for ethical reasoning, and democratic knowledge and engagement, global acumen, I'm not quite sure what global acumen is, and the capacity to work productively with diverse people and perspectives. And finally, the ability to apply knowledge, skills, and responsibilities to complex problems and new settings. So the competencies humanities students pick up tend to be rated highly by these employers, and competencies related to technology, the mechanical, mathematical, quantitative, were ranked lower. I think it's important to stress that the range of competencies here are taught across the humanities curriculum, but they often get developed with particular focus in rhetoric and composition courses. So that in articulating the value of a humanities education, especially those of us in English departments, we ought to be careful to stress the key role of rhetoric and composition courses, of writing across the curriculum requirements as well. It doesn't serve anyone to think of these kinds of courses as simply service courses or as courses set apart from, or even worse, ranked below literature courses in English departments, since the teaching of writing is a key feature in both literature and composition courses. And indeed, it ought to be a key feature of all humanities courses. This is one of the reasons why I think clearly sustaining a robust set of core curriculum requirements, including foreign language requirements, is so central to the survival of the humanities. Humanities majors shouldn't be the only students who benefit from the unique educational experiences humanities courses offer. All students should have that opportunity. We can help ensure the survival of the humanities by strengthening writing requirements, continuing to encourage students to major in its disciplines, and also by supporting or implementing core requirements that ensure the humanities play a central role for all students in higher education. So this isn't the time to be reducing humanities budgets. Humanities students are learning just the kinds of skills that employers are looking for at the same time that they're gaining core knowledge in traditional disciplines. There's another overly reductive way of thinking about the humanities that I want to close by talking about. And that's the divide between what I'll call tradition, the divide among humanists between tradition and critique, and people outside the humanities too. A view of the humanities on the one hand that sees them as being about preserving historical knowledge in the arts, history, and philosophy, and on the other hand, a view of the humanities that sees them as being about fostering critical thinking about humanism and the traditional orientation of a humanist education. I call them the curatorial and the critical models of the humanities, and I'm thinking of an article which I write about in my book by Andrew Delbanco, which argues that the main job of the humanities is to curate, and too much critique ruins the humanities. The curatorial model of the humanities sees their primary responsibility as preserving and handing down to students from generation to generation the Arnoldian ideal of the best that's been thought and said. For critics like Delbanco, too much of what he calls critique gets in the way of this responsibility and ends up alienating students and the broader public. But for the critical or the post-humanist, the responsibility of the humanities is not only to teach the tradition, but also to foster a constructive and critical debate about the tradition, to expand the traditional forms of humanistic study in ways that not only engage new theories about the human, but also expand the range of subjects conventionally associated with the humanities. The curatorial model tends to put most of the stress on tradition, seeing a focus on theory and too much attention to non-canonical works as a threat to the humanities, while the critical or the post-humanist model puts much of the stress on innovation and on expanding the subjects and critical theories humanities students encounter. Ever since I began writing about the humanities crisis in earnest 5 or 6 years ago, I've been arguing that the challenge we face is not convincing people that the humanities matter, but convincing people that an innovative, transformed, critical humanities matter. It seemed to me that too many defenses of the humanities tended to fall back on predictable, static, sometimes shop-worn versions of the humanities, as if the last 30 or 40 years never happened. I think that's a problem with the overly narrow curatorial model Del Banco endorses, especially because it uses critical theory as a kind of whipping boy in the blame game about why the humanities have supposedly gone astray. I disagree with him. As I argue in my book, I believe contemporary critical theory has, on the whole, had a positive impact on the humanities. As I noted a moment ago, there's no statistical evidence to claim otherwise. Generations of students have begun to learn that the humanities disciplines, like the social and natural sciences, have theories and methodologies that shape the work of scholars. And that those theories and methodologies also end up shaping the very objects of knowledge we study. I think that's a big plus. I think that sophisticates our students. Our students are becoming much more savvy about the role that language plays in the constitution of meaning and the production of truth claims, and about how both are shaped by interpretive frameworks reflecting the discursive practices of a variety of institutions and ideologies. If we've taught our students to be more skeptical of traditional ideas, it's because we've taught them to be more careful and skeptical readers, since we've increasingly focused their attention on the role language and textuality play in constructing, circulating, and undermining common sense truths. This is what in the humanities we like to call critical thinking, something that all too often is invoked as a value without being given much substance at all, and which I argue gets taught most thoroughly in courses that stress critical theory. For example, one of the key features of the contemporary humanities is that they teach students to think critically about a variety of different approaches to reading and textual interpretation. For this reason, I wince when defenders of the humanities like Kevin Riley, former president of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, writing just a few days ago in the New Republic, claimed that the problem with the humanities derived from its use of what he called insider jargon. And he cited terms like hermeneutics as an example. Hermeneutics. Not only is there nothing, I'm here to tell Kevin Riley, who was an English professor, not only is there nothing wrong with the humanities students knowing what the term hermeneutics mean, they ought to know what the term hermeneutics means. My students know what hermeneutics means. How can you teach students to interpret textual materials if you don't teach them how to interpret textual materials, and if you don't expose them to a range of interpretive frameworks, and if they don't know that the field they're learning about is called hermeneutics? It doesn't make any sense. So defenders of the humanities like Riley, who want to blame insider jargon for what they think is the crisis of the humanities, I think are looking in the wrong place. And they're doing a disservice to scholars across the disciplines, not only of the humanities, but the social and natural sciences, who've developed theories, methodologies, and professionalized language in their research and scholarship. What's wrong with that? We profess. We're professors. Not only is there nothing wrong with that, it's at the center of our work as scholars. Why should the disciplines of the natural and social sciences have theories and methodologies, while the humanities limit themselves to loose, informal conversations about things like the human condition and the meaning of life. I have nothing against the human condition or the meaning of life. But why should we limit ourselves to loose talk about those general topics? That static, narrow view of the humanities, I think, is counterproductive to any reasonable defense of the current value of the humanities in higher education. Indeed, theory in the form of critiques has been central to humanism over the whole course of history. And I'm going to skip over this part of the paper and wrap up. But the case I make here is that critique is central to the whole history of humanism. Humanism is about thinking critically about received values and challenging traditional notions of what's valuable, including thinking critically about the frameworks of evaluation we use to think about value. So my argument is that contemporary theory has had a positive, salutary effect on work in the humanities, and that it's made our students more sophisticated in terms of the critical thinking that they're doing. And to come back to this business of practical skills and wrap up, ironically, the whipping boy for the statistics, which is critical theory, ends up representing some of the courses in which our students learn the very practical skills most intensively that employers, ironically, who know nothing about structuralism or deconstruction, are looking for with their students. So, in closing, I want to stress that my main message about the survival of humanities is pretty simple. Divided, we lose. Divided, we lose. What's great about the humanities is the way in which they preserve and value the past, but in a context in which the past is subject to reflective and constructive critique. So that the way in which we think about what constitutes the human keeps changing, and that's a good thing. And the collection of texts, ideas, historical events, and cultural forms that we discuss with our students keeps expanding as well, and that's a good thing. I don't believe it does anyone any good when those who think of themselves as defending a traditional conception of the humanities treat that conception as fixed and sacrosanct, when they publicly proclaim its demise because new theories, new methodologies, and subject areas have emerged to supplement traditional subjects and approaches. It seems to me we ought to celebrate the humanities as a constellation of disciplines that help students develop knowledge in both traditional and non-traditional subject areas, to explore the history of how humanism has shaped our ideas about human nature, individual agency, and social justice within a diverse cultural, national, and transnational framework. Because new theories and methodologies in the humanities always challenge and expand those ideas, I believe we ought to pay close attention, along with our students, to the social and historical construction of the ideas they encounter and the claims they find the writers and artists they study making. Because it's by focusing on the perpetual and productive conflict between tradition and innovation that a humanities education fosters both cultural literacy and critical literacy, knowledge in the traditional subject areas of the humanities, and a range of skills: reading, analytical, interpretive, writing, critical thinking, that are used not only in the humanities classroom, but also in the world outside the classroom. One more paragraph, I'm going to skip it. Thanks.
I know there will be questions, and I want to allow you to do that. But before you interrogate him, I want to thank you all for coming, and especially those people who persisted throughout the day on a Friday that is in spring, and I thank you all for coming. I also want to thank the advisory board of the Humanities Center for selecting this theme and for helping me to organize it. And I want to thank my staff. They're in the background, and people praise me for these things when they go well and blame me when they don't. But my staff is always here to put it together. So Lakeisha Burns is our administrative assistant, and Anisha Bash, and Rodina Peace, and Shamira Tellis, and Gloria Sakuri are the people who helped me. So I'd like you to give them a round of applause. And now, get to it.
Questions, comments? Yeah.
So as a communication person, obviously for me labels matter. And one of the
Labels matter.
Labels
Yeah,
matter.
yeah.
Labels
Can you
matter.
speak louder?
Labels matter.
Labels matter.
One of the things which has really been so successful for fields like, say, the hard sciences has been this acronym of STEM, for instance.
STEM,
Right.
yeah.
And increasingly, we are seeing some policymakers, at least in some universities, trying to highlight the place of the humanities and the social sciences within that constellation, and
Yeah.
argue for a new acronym called STEAM.
STEAM,
Right.
putting the arts into the
How
STEM.
much traction are you seeing?
Or
this
stream
new
if you want to add
acronym getting?
reading. How much traction from?
Do you think that this is getting in terms of university administrators or legislators or where do you see this? I mean, do you see much of a future for STEAM as opposed to STEM?
Yeah. There are a lot of people in the humanities and in technology fields and in the sciences who are really interested in and doing work on thinking about education in an integrated kind of way that recognizes the interdependence and interrelationship between scientific, technological, and humanistic and aesthetic approaches to similar problems, right? Kathy Davidson helps run this online group called Haystack, H-A-S-T-A-C. It's one of the, and I forget what the acronym stands, Humanities and Sciences, something collaboratory. Okay, and so she and her colleagues are extraordinary. She's on the President's Humanities Council too, and never seems to sleep. Kathy Davidson, yeah, Haystack, H-A-S-T-A-C. So that's one online. That's one online example. I mean, it's a big group where people are working really hard across the sciences, the fields of technology, and the humanities to form new alliances and get past these divides. And I mean, I'm somewhat cynical about the labels, but I think you have to play that game, and I think it's important. It's more than a game. I mean, it is changing. If you can change STEM to STEAM, if you can get a lot of people noticing that people want to change STEM to STEAM, something will come of that. It's incremental, but I think we try to make big institutional changes, but we also need to make branding changes, so that's really important. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I thought of, first of all, I guess I have two comments or questions. One is definitely more of a comment, which is just, I find the whole kind of curatorial argument kind of hilarious, particularly the way that you put it. I mean, it sounds almost more like what would actually happen if it was impossible to follow that route, would be more like mummification.
Yeah.
Because nothing keeps the thing alive
Yeah.
more than debate, actually.
Right.
Debate it, then
Right.
just really
Well,
but-
in my book, I point out that you can't curate something without doing critique.
Right.
I mean, I would love to be a curator in a museum, but if you're a curator in a museum, you're looking through the art that you've got in the museum, if it's an art museum, but you're also thinking of other collections. What kind of shows can you do that puts this with that and makes new juxtapositions and produces new knowledge or insights? That's doing critique. So I think Del Banco is missing how you can't curate without doing critique, and critique is a form of curation. My critical theory, introductory critical theory course curates contemporary critical theory for my students, in a certain kind of way.
But I guess one question I was wondering about was how you see this playing out between different types of institutions. If you want to juxtapose extremes and say like a small, like four-year liberal arts college that's based on that kind of curriculum versus a large public university where you might have lots of first-time college students. Clearly, the way you talk about the humanities, the value of the humanities might be different in this context. Although I think you can talk about it in a similar way across both places. I think one of the problems is that there's sometimes a lack of awareness of the relationship between the sometimes implicit elitism of arguments in favor of humanities and kind of a lack of understanding privilege. And I think that the use of the humanities have a really important use for regardless of what your goals are after school, but I feel like the humanities does not help itself out by not putting itself in a position to have that discussion.
Right. Well, that's the argument I'm making, that we can't just fall back on a sort of, we can't fall back on defending a 1940s or 1950s version of the humanities as if the last 30, 40, 50 years didn't happen. I think we have to explain what we're doing in the humanities today and why it's relevant to students. And I think what we're doing in the humanities today that's relevant to students is relevant to students at big public universities and to smaller private universities. And I don't think at research institutions that you ought to be doing your disciplinary work in a more professionalized way in the classroom, and at four-year colleges that are more teaching intensive, avoiding that. My argument in the book is that the bad rap on the professionalization of humanities faculty is really counterproductive and insulting, but also misses the fact that the professional theory, the professional methods that we use as scholars are important for us to teach our students. Those are skills. So the whole idea that teaching literature or teaching philosophy or teaching history ought to be detached from the professional interests and protocols of the faculty, I think is wrong-headed, whether you're talking about a big public institution or a smaller private institution, whether you're talking about the University of Illinois or Loyola University. Alyssa, you had your hand up, and then 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
So I really like your explanation that talks more about the general tendency of changing our expectations of the higher educational system. So for instance, this orientation towards the vocational and skill-based practical approach. And I see this as something that really inhibits the prominence of humanities. I was wondering if you have any other theories or explanations in your book or otherwise of why humanities don't gain the type of prominence that we would like them to gain, or sometimes they lose the prominence as the time goes. And I was also wondering, in the context of globalization, that makes it counterintuitive to me, because when we live in a globalized world, the role of humanities should go up extremely, because to run a global business or to do any kind of interaction with other cultures, you have to have the knowledge of humanities first, even before you have some of these other skills. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, what is the role of globalization in the current position of humanities, and what are the driving forces behind the kind of...
Well, those are good questions. I think it helps the humanities a lot to stress the extent to which in our courses and in our curricula that our courses and curricula and focus has become increasingly transnational. That was the subject of my last book, Global Matters, what was it called? Global Matters, the Transnationalization of Literary Studies. It's not just literary studies that's become transnational. Every discipline has become transnational in the humanities and in the social sciences. And since being a global citizen and being a global worker, in other words, whatever job you're going to get it's more and more likely you're going to be traveling a lot and interacting with people who were born and raised in very different places from you. That means it's really important that education include some sort of multicultural, global perspective. We're good about doing that in the humanities. It's much easier to produce a global or multicultural perspective in a history or philosophy course than it is in a chemistry or biology course, right? So I think that's a strength that's a strength we ought to play, you know. And one of the reasons I think why the humanities has gotten sort of boxed in is because, especially beginning in the mid '80s, we entered the computer age, we entered the digital age, the world of the technological and the digital, which is what our students are really into, right? And of course now we have the digital humanities, and that's a mixed bag, right? It's a mixed bag because if narrowly the digital, I mean, a lot of people on the left say, oh God, the digital humanities, it means people just want to talk about code instead of overthrowing patriarchy, you know? The social and political issues we've been talking about in the 80s and 90s reflected in literature and philosophy, questions about race and gender and class and social inequality, that all goes out the window with the digital humanities, supposedly, because it's all about learning how to write code, and it's all about moving manuscripts online and learning how to move manuscripts online and all that. So this is the conclusion of my book. I talk a lot about the digital humanities, the ups and the positives and the potential negatives. But on the positive side, I think, you know, if you think of the humanities broadly as being involved in cultural studies, the study of the rise of digital culture and the nature and function of digital culture is a whole new field in communication and in cultural studies, which is really exciting. Well, we have a digital humanities center at Loyola, and we have an MA in it. But a lot of the people who teach in it know how to write code, but they're also really interesting cultural critics. One of my colleague Steve Jones, who helped found it, wrote a book on video games. I just finished doing a dissertation defense with a guy. I didn't defend my dissertation. I directed it, and he did a dissertation that was partly about novels and fiction and partly about video games, you know. And I have another dissertation coming up towards a defense that also does that. So there are exciting interfaces with digital humanities, but some potential pitfalls too. You had your hand up.
Yeah, Jose Coelho, I teach in the Department of History and Latino Studies.
Ah, great.
I've been here at Wayne since 1989, so 26 years, I believe. I want to agree with you and disagree with you on a couple of topics. One is that, particularly at Wayne, we're already a corporate university.
Yeah.
In terms of funding. 15 years ago, we received 75% of our income directly from the state of Michigan. Now we receive 75% of our income and growing directly from tuition.
Yeah.
So we got a brand name of public university, but we're private.
Yeah.
I had an accidental encounter with the chief financial officer of Wayne, and I said, we're heading for privatization, aren't we? We're going to be a big charter school. He says, you're exactly right. There's so in the corporatization of Wayne, the cutting off of funding has forced Wayne, even humanities scholars like the provost and whoever, you know, part of the administration, to run us as if it's a corporation, because they have to cut severely, and the severe cuts have come at the bottom of support staff. So for example, we got one secretary out of 3 or 4 that we used to have 10 years ago. The faculty are being restricted. It began with the taking of our office telephones away because they were useless. Use your cell phone. It's impossible to get the money to travel without going through an intricate maze of bureaucracy that just a lot of faculty are now paying for their own travel rather than going through that. So that's part of what's happening. But also the corporatization means that the students are getting killed. They're getting killed. In just 5 years, the cost of tuition has gone, the debt that a college graduate has, from $25,000 to $30,000. And that has had an incredible impact on the working class of Wayne, the middle class of Wayne. Wayne, when I came in '89 and through the '90s, we had about 32,500 students enrolled. I checked for this semester, we have 25,000. There's an incredible attrition that's occurring. And then the other comment I want to say is that I think that the trouble with the humanities in higher education and the benefits and the interest that students should have in us are projections of what we think the students should be thinking. In other words, you and I are selective products. We're the last two sperms that got through the whole barrier, and so we think, oh, we're intellectuals, everybody should think like us. I polled my students on a regular basis, and I came from a working class. The same conditions of working student attitude towards higher education in 1965 when I started, and today, because I asked them, what is it that you want out of your education? 100% usually says, graduate. I want to graduate. They don't say I want to grow.
Yeah.
They want to graduate.
They
I
want to
said,
finish, yeah.
I said, how many of you would leave college right now if you were offered a decent job that you thought was well paid? 100%. Only one student once told me no. He said, it takes me 4 years to develop my musical training, then I'll get out of here. And the other two more comments and I'll stop. One is that I'm not sure that we're succeeding that well. Part of the crunch is that, for example, only about 30+% of students actually graduate nationwide in 4 years. There's another study that says that over 30% of college graduates think no more better critically in terms of critical thinking than when they first came in.
Are you thinking of the book Academically Adrift? The
There's,
findings in that book?
Yeah, I haven't.
Yeah.
I got a whole bunch of sources. As a historian, I'm terrible at the sources. And there's a more recent one that said that even the elite colleges, the universities it costs tens of thousands of dollars to go per year, that they are producing students who are intelligent sheep.
Yeah.
That they think only in economic terms, they think not humanistic. And so the goal, I asked my students, what do you want? Well, I just want to get a job. And so what we have is a college generation that is essentially going through forced learning. And
Yeah.
I can go on forever and tell
Well, but you don't want to do
you
that.
get the message.
Yeah. I think one of the...
Stop.
I'm sorry, Walter's told me we're being kicked out in
Okay,
5
let's
minutes,
go.
so we should give
One of-
Paul a
one-
moment to respond here.
One of the huge problems, I think, is that the value of learning, reading, thinking, getting an education is not instilled in kids at a really young age. So by the time they get to me, or by the time they get to you, or by the time they get to high school, it's the last thing they want to be doing. And they just want to grow up and get a job. And by then, we've sort of lost, right? Because how do you, I mean, it does happen, right? I get students all the time, well, now and then, who sort of turn on to getting educated, you know, and they tell me, gee, I never really cared much about reading and thinking and learning and getting an education, but now I get really interested. But that doesn't happen all that often, and I think that's a broad cultural problem. It has to do with poverty. It has to do with the breakdown of families. It has to do with the breakdown of all kinds of institutions. It has to do with the underfunding of grade schools. You know, I mean, the environment for learning should be heavily funded for young kids, so that by the time they get to college, they really care about funding. Number one. Number two, Academically Adrift, a book I talk about in my book. They study the CLA scores, college learning assessment scores, that a lot of universities look at to see how much their students learn. And that book got a lot of press, rightly so. And their main message was most college students or university students, like you're saying, don't learn hardly anything. But, and I highlight this in my book, there's one exception. The students who do demonstrate fairly dramatic learning are students in the liberal arts who take courses that require them to write 20 pages or more, which isn't a lot. 20 pages or more. If students take courses where they have to write 20 pages or more, they score much higher on this CLA, right? So these are humanities courses, and these are teaching intensive courses. You know what it's like to, those of you who teach courses where you assign 2 10-page papers and 1 20-page paper at the end. That's a lot of reading, especially if you're paying attention to the grammar and punctuation and the mechanics, like are they writing clear sentences? So there is a bright spot in that academically adrift. The other point I was going to make is the more tuition goes up, the more expensive a college education gets. That just feeds this idea that it's all about jobs, right? I mean, if you're a parent, if you're buying a house to put your kid through school, if you're spending $500,000-$600,000 to put your kid through school now, as opposed to 25 years ago, they enroll in the University of California, and your fees are $2,000 or $3,000 a year, you're going to be a lot more concerned about whether they're going to be able to get a job and what kind of job it is, and so are they, than 20, 25 years ago when the cost of tuition was lower. So yeah, the higher the cost of an education is, the more the bottom line and the vocational training model kicks in. Yeah.
Well, obviously, this is a really stimulating conversation that you've provoked, and
Are you
I'd like
sure?
to, yes, I'd like to invite everyone up to the reception in Room J of McGregor.
Sure, sure.
And I'd also like us to thank our keynote speaker.
I am sure you
Oh,
can just
I.
walk along with him now through this pathway up